I wanted to mention David mentioned yesterday about something from
Oh,
Jewish
God.
press about a shiloh where a person had an esrog hanging from his schach as part of the decorations, and someone needed an esrog. Somehow his esrog got puzzled. He needed an esrog. Is he allowed to use it? It's part of the decorations for the sukkah. Are you allowed to benefit from the sukkah? We know that you're normally not allowed to. But the question was, would this be some type of exception to be able to use it for the mitzvah? So I looked it up and I found that it's a biur halacha. It's right it's on the side of the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Brura wrote a commentary called the biur halacha. It's the more academic part of his halachic rulings. And in the biur halacha, he brings a chasam sofer that says that a person had an esrog that was extra, so he hung it in the sukkah for beautification purposes. And afterwards, on Yom Tov, a person came from a village and he couldn't find any esrogim to buy. And so the Chassam Sofer paskined that he would be allowed to take the esrog that's hanging on the sukkah for beauty and to fulfill the mitzvah with it. And although on Yom Tov it would be prohibited because of muktzah, that you're not allowed to touch something that was not planned on being used on Yom Tov, which is something like that was hanging, from the schach. So that would be, muktzah on Yom Tov. But nevertheless, on Chol Hamoed, it would be mutter, permissible to move and to use and to fulfill for the mitzvah of shaking lulav. The question is, how does that fit with what we have been learning about the prohibition to benefit from not only the wood of the sukkah, but any of the decorations of the sukkah? And here you're using the esrog. So the answer is that we're dealing with the two types of muktzah here. The one that's prohibited on Shabbos and Yom Tov, that we said, you're right, you have a problem. You can't move it on Shabbos and Yom Tov. It's muktzah. It was set aside that it's not considered a vessel or a usable object. You actually cannot use it on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Well, what about Chol Hamoed? So now comes the second concept of muktzah, which is something that's set aside for a mitzvah. You're not supposed to take benefit from it. So here the Chassam Sofer comes along and he says two major important factors that play a role in his psak, why it's permissible for this man to use this esrog to fulfill the mitzvah. Number one, there's a rule that mitzvahs lav lihanos nitnu. You don't benefit a physical benefit from a mitzvah. So although you're not allowed to benefit from the walls of the sukkah and from the schach of the sukkah, from the decorations of the sukkah, but that is a physical benefit that you're not allowed to have, not a spiritual type of benefit that's not called hana'ah, it's not called benefit. So that would be one reason why you could fulfill the mitzvah with this esrog. And then Chassam Sofer says, and also this that we say that it's muktzah, things that are set aside for a mitzvah that you can't benefit from, that's all about bizui mitzvah. That's about desecrating and shaming the mitzvah. And here it's not shaming the mitzvah because in the beginning it was used for beautification of the mitzvah, of the sukkah, and now you're doing an actual mitzvah with it saying a bracha on it. So you're doing the opposite of shaming the object, but the shaming the mitzvah, you're doing something positive to elevating it to another level of a mitzvah and a bracha on it. And so he concludes that it's even permissible for the owner to take money for such an esrog. You got to look there for the reason. But that would be, so that's a Chassam Sofer. Now, there are other Achronim, later commentaries, that I see in the Piskei Teshuvos. He brings over here that question, this psak din from the Chassam Sofer. But this is the This is listen, it's a Chasam Sefer, and there's even a Maram Shik that explains it and tries to answer the questions. But there are other Achronim that do ask questions on it. But this is brought in the Bir Halacha, and it's a Chasam Sefer. So this seems to be what David might have been quoting, what they were probably, and it's here in the Bir Halacha in chapter 638 of Orach Chaim of Shulchan Aruch, in chapter 638. Okay, now let me mute everyone here. Doesn't work. Huh. Strange. Okay. Okay, we did that. Now, so that's the Shulchan Aruch here. Now let's get back to what we were learning. Page 47A. 47A. And we did get stuck actually on 46B, the bottom Tosfos over there. Yesterday I mentioned it's a little it's unclear how Tosfos is answering this seeming contradiction, or it just seems to be hard to explain the Gemara. The Gemara said that there seems to be a difference between in Israel and outside in the diaspora regarding the law of benefiting from the Esrog on Shmini Atzeres. In Israel, the law was, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that the Esrog you're allowed to benefit from, and you could eat it on Shmini Atzeres in Israel. The Sukkah not. Sukkah you'd have to wait till after Shmini Atzeres would be prohibited, but the Esrog you'd be allowed to eat it on Shmini Atzeres in Israel. Outside of Israel, that's what the Gemara that at the bottom of the page was saying. Abaye says that the Esrog outside of Israel, the 8th day is questionable if it's the 7th day, because outside of Israel, we always are concerned that maybe there was a mistake in the calculation. We don't know for sure how they calculated in Israel, what day was the first day, Rosh Chodesh. And so therefore, the 8th day might be the 7th day, and the 8th day would be prohibited to benefit from the Esrog. And it sounds a little strange. In Israel, we're going to say that the Esrog is permitted to benefit from. And outside of Israel, we're going to say that the Esrog is prohibited to benefit from. And what's the reason for such a, what would the reason be for such a distinction? Why would there be a difference that outside of Israel, you won't be allowed to benefit from the Esrog? So on a very simple level, the way Rashi seems to understand it, and it seemed that this is the understanding, is that, in Israel, they know that the 8th day is the 8th day. So they know that the Esrog is no longer being used for mitzvah. Outside of Israel, because the 8th day is really a question if it's the 7th day, so although we don't use the Esrog, but because it has that question that it might really be, maybe it should be being used, therefore, we are going to
use for any yarmulkes. Sometimes you have a key. You want to know.
Isaac, are you talking to us? I think you're speaking to someone else. So what we were saying is that the 8th day is a suffix. It's questionable if it's the 7th day. Therefore, we're going to be machmir and say you can't benefit from the Esrog. Don't take a bite out of the Esrog on Shmini Atzeres. Why? Because essentially you should be shaking this Esrog today. It might be the seventh day. So we don't do it because it might be muktzah. It's considered like it's muktzah. It's to be zoyin for Yom Tov. But essentially, we should be shaking it. So because of that, the prohibition of the esrog somehow stays. It was we had a prohibition eating the esrog before. Now we're not even shaking it. So we're stretching the rule a little. In other words, it's really not being used for a mitzvah today. But because it's considered questionable if today is really the seventh day of Hoshana Rabbah, and therefore we're going to say that it's prohibited to eat the esrog. Tosfos doesn't learn this way. Tosfos says that the eighth day, the reason why in Eretz Yisrael it's permissible to benefit from the esrog in the eighth day, there's no suffix. We know it's the eighth day. And the only thought would be, the way Tosfos sees it, is that maybe we should prohibit it, not because Bein Hashmashos it was prohibited and it stays prohibited, like a Sukkah, and would be prohibited on the next day. That's totally not the thought here. And he says the reason why it might be prohibited in Eretz Yisrael, the reason why you would think it might be prohibited in Eretz Yisrael is because of a gzeira. You might say that if we permit you to eat the esrog, you might end up burning the sukkah wood. And so Tosfos says that would have been a thought. And the thing is that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't hold of that issue, and it's not a gzeira. We don't make a gzeira. So we don't make a gzeira lulav for sukkah, that if we permit you to eat the esrog, you might end up burning the sukkah wood. And so therefore they're two separate things. We're not afraid. We're not afraid you're going to do that. He says, outside of Israel, where the eighth day might be the seventh day, it's called the Sveika de Yoima. The eighth day, Shmini Atzeres, might be the seventh day. So there we are going to make a gzeira, even though you don't make a bracha on the lulav, but we're going to make a gzeira that maybe if we permit you to eat the esrog, you're going to end up burning the sukkah wood. Somehow we're nervous about that. Why would we be nervous that if we permit you, in other words, why in Israel, if we permit you to eat the esrog, you're not going to do such a thing? You're not going to end up burning the sukkah wood. But outside of Israel, if we permit you to eat the esrog, there you are going to. So I struggled yesterday trying to figure this out. So there seems to be two ways of learning. One way of learning is that the prohibition in Eretz Yisrael would simply be like a gzeira. Sukkah is going to be prohibited to benefit from on Shmini Atzeres, which we explained in the Gemara, that because the night before was prohibited, therefore you might eat a meat and you might eat a meal the night before, and twilight it's prohibited. Bein Hashmashos is going to be prohibited the next day. We're gonna say it's not allowed. That's rabbinic law. Iskatsoi bein hashmashos, iskatsoi l'kulei yom. Something that's set aside for the mitzvah during the bein hashmashos period, during the twilight period, it's set aside for the next day. That's a rabbinic law. So Tosfos says there, we're not making a gzeira. Don't eat your esrog because you might end up burning the sukkah wood. Burning the sukkah wood on Shmini Atzeres is only a rabbinic prohibition of the fact that it was iskatsoi, it was set aside for a mitzvah, bein hashmashos. That's only a rabbinic extension of the prohibition, the general prohibition of eating, of burning the sukkah, the mitzvah. That's a general prohibition of biblical, but the bein hashmashos element of it, where it's prohibited bein hashmashos, we say the whole next day becomes prohibited. That's a rabbinic extension of it. So we don't make a gzeira. However, outside of Israel, the prohibition of Sukkah is that, in other words, the mitzvah of Sukkah is a biblical mitzvah for 7 days. So if today is the 8th day, but it's a suffix, it's a doubt that it might be considered the 7th day, what comes out is that there's a biblical obligation not to burn the Sukkah wood today. Because why? Because it could be the 7th day. It could be the 7th day, and there's a biblical prohibition of benefiting from the wood of the sukkah. There we will make a gzeira. So outside of Israel, we'll tell you can't eat your esrog. Why? Gzeira, you might end up burning your sukkah wood. Why is there a gzeira here? Because burning the sukkah here outside of Israel is a biblical law, and therefore, in other words, we learned way back that the prohibition of benefiting from the sukkah, which is being used for a mitzvah, the prohibition is biblical. Why? Because it says Chag HaSukkos Tasa LaHashem Elokecha. So it's the sukkah is considered like a chagiga. It's a chag. It's the sukkah has an element of korban. It's set aside for the mitzvah. It's biblically prohibited to benefit from it. In Eretz Yisrael, it's on the 8th day. It's not biblically prohibited to benefit from and to use for wood. But the problem is katsoi bein hashmashos. It's sort of like an extension of that prohibition of the fact that it was set aside bein hashmashos. So there we're going to have a different rule. But outside of Israel, in Chutz La'aretz, here we're going to say you have a rabbinic decree. So that's one way of learning the differentiation, the way Tues is going to understand it. Again, Tues follows this logic of making these type of gezerah between comparing the lulav and the esrog to a sukkah. That's the way Tues seems to be understanding it based on his previous learning of the Gemara and the way explaining Levi's opinion, which we explained earlier. Now, the other way of learning Tues is that Tues is really saying what the Ran says. And what the Ran says is that outside of Israel, we are nervous that you will end up. What are we nervous of? You're going to end up, if we permit you to eat your esrog, you're going to end up not sitting in the sukkah. Why? Because you're going to say, I can eat my esrog. It's no longer sukkahs. I'm eating my esrog. I'm eating my esrog on Shmini Atzeres. I don't have to sit in the sukkah. So then it says, therefore the rabbis decreed that you have to dwell in you have to eat. You're not allowed to eat the esrog, because by not eating the esrog, you won't end coming to not dwelling in the sukkah. So the gzeira that Tues mentions here, the way this understanding would be, is not that it's a gzeira that you might end up burning the wood of the sukkah. It's a gzeira that you might end up not dwelling in the sukkah. And therefore, outside of Israel, we're afraid of that. In Israel, we're not afraid of that. In Israel, if we let you eat the esrog, which we do, you can eat the esrog on Shmini Atzeres. If we let you eat the esrog on Shmini Atzeres, are you going to end up not sitting in the sukkah? Yeah, and you're allowed. You're that's the way you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres in Eretz Yisrael. So there's no problem. That's why it's fine to eat the esrog, because you're going to say, I'm eating the esrog. It's for sure not sukkahs anymore. It's Shmini Atzeres. It's not sukkahs anymore. Okay. And now I'm not going to dwell in the sukkah. Okay, don't dwell in the sukkah. That's the best. We don't want you to dwell in the sukkah. However, outside of Israel, where you're supposed to dwell in the sukkah, here comes along Tues and says, you're going to eat the esrog. What's going to happen? You're going to end up, people are going to say, eating the esrog, you're allowed to eat the esrog. Why? Because it's no longer sukkahs, it's Shmini Atzeres. It's Shmini Atzeres. I don't have to dwell in the sukkah either. And that, the Chacham said, is a problem, because really you need to dwell in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. Therefore, they made a gzeira. So the way they, the understanding of Taisus now would be that it's a gzeira atu sukkah they made a gzeira atu that you should make sure to dwell in this. It's a gzeira that you might not end up dwelling in the sukkah. It's not about burning the wood of the sukkah. That's the gzeira here. That's the understanding of Abaye, and that's the way the Ran says it, and that would be the another pshat in Taisus. So again, we have two pshatim in Taisus. Either it's a gzeira on a derabanan versus a gzeira on a doraisa, or it's a gzeira of maybe someone not dwelling in the sukkah, and that would not apply in Eretz Yisrael. It would only apply in Chutz La'aretz. Okay, so that was the discussion there. And then Tosfos concludes. He says the ninth day, which would be Simchas Torah, that we don't have to worry at all. And of course, there's no reason to be concerned on the ninth day. For the eighth day, there would be absolutely no reason. Number one, it would only be a migud is katsoi. It would only be it would only it wouldn't apply the prohibition to eat it. It would also be no problem if you end up eating the esrog on Simchas Torah. People are going to end up not dwelling in the sukkah. That's great. We don't want you to dwell in the sukkah on Simchas Torah. You're not supposed to dwell in the sukkah on Simchas Torah. So that's basically the explanation. Just finishing up from yesterday, what we left hanging. So the Gemara that we learned yesterday, we started talking about the fact that the Gemara says Meisiv. What's the conclusion of the Gemara? It's the conclusion of the Gemara is Meisiv Yasvinon Bruche Loim Avarchinu. That's the conclusion of the Gemara. The conclusion of the Gemara is really about 15 lines from the top of the page on 47a, where it says, on Shmini Atzeres, outside of Israel, you're supposed to dwell in the sukkah, but you don't say a bracha. And we got involved in the discussion of why do some Hasidim seem to think that you can get away with not eating in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. And Shulchan Aruch seems to be very clear that you do need to dwell in the sukkah. So what I wanted to touch on is, number one, let's get more into that. What's this heter about? Number two, how does it express itself as well regarding sleeping in the sukkah and regarding eating foods that don't require a sukkah on Shmini Atzeres? So what is the reason? Why do we dwell in the sukkah? But at the same time, we do not shake lulav. We're calling the 8th day of Shmini Atzeres, we're calling it maybe the 7th day. We're dwelling in the sukkah. We're saying it's a suffix 7th day. It might be considered, we are concerned that it might be considered really the 7th day of Sukkot. And so why do we dwell in the sukkah, but yet we don't shake lulav and esrog? So this Tosfos asked, the top Tosfos, and Tosfos explained that there is a problem with shaking lulav and esrog, because if you shake lulav and esrog, what are people going to say? They're going to say today is Chol HaMoyed. It's not Shmini Atzeres. You're acting like Chol HaMoyed. Why are you shaking lulav? Shmini Atzeres is no mitzvah to shake lulav. It talks about the lulav in the Beis Hamikdash, Smachtem L'fnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim, that they would shake lulav 7 days. And the rabbinic law outside, is Zeichel Hamikdash, that we have to shake lulav 7 days. So Shmini Atzeres is no mitzvah to shake lulav. So if you were to shake lulav on Shmini Atzeres, what people are going to say is, you're acting like Chol HaMoyed. You're doing an act that's like Chol HaMoyed. That is a zilzul in Yom Tov. Why are you pretending to be that this is, why are you acting in a way that this is Chol HaMoyed? Because on Shmini Atzeres, we don't shake lulav. So if you're moving, so the lulav would basically not have any usage on Shmini Atzeres. So if you're shaking the lulav, this would be a sign. This would be a zilzul for. This would be a zilzul for Yom Tov. Now, it doesn't really, not necessarily a problem to eat the esrog. Of course, the esrog would be another discussion. Would you be allowed to eat the esrog or maybe smell the esrog? But the problem is the lulav. The lulav has zero use unless you're using it for a mitzvah. So if you're using it on Shmini Atzeres, basically what you're doing is saying that this is Chol HaMoed. You're giving it this. You're making a zilzal in Yom Tov. That's one of the reasons. That's what Tosfos seems to be saying. He says it's a noyeg by minhag choil. He doesn't use the word zilzal, but that's what he's using. He uses the term you're noyeg minhag choil. You're acting with mundane activities. Touching a lulav is a mundane matter, unless it was a mitzvah. But so you want to shake the lulav. And if we have you shake the lulav, it's acting in a way of choil, and therefore you can't do it. But a sukkah, there's no problem because people love eating outside. It's sometimes the sukkah is very pleasant, and you eat there. Even you eat outside, even on a Yom Tov. What's wrong? You want to eat outside. So the sukkah wouldn't be a problem, but the lulav would be a zilzul. This is the understanding of Tosfos. Now, other commentaries mention other reasons. The Rif says if you shake lulav on Shmini Atzeres, what you're doing is a contradiction because you're claiming this is Shmini Atzeres and you're shaking lulav. How could you do that? You're doing a tarti desasri. They're contradictory. And the Rav Yah says a different problem. You're doing baltoisif. You're shaking lulav. It looks like baltoisif. You're adding on to a mitzvah. You're doing more than you're adding on to the Torah. You're shaking the lulav when there is no reason to shake lulav. So this would be a baltoisif prohibition. The Rav Yah, according to the Rav Yah, brought down that because of this understanding that it's baltoisif, so the Rav Yah says your only permit is to eat in the sukkah. If you want to sleep in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, absolutely not. Baltoisif. Eating in the sukkah you can get away with, because eating in the sukkah you want to eat outside. But how could you? You can eat outside. No, you get away with that for a different reason. You could get away with eating in the sukkah because you're not saying a bracha. You have a heker because you're not saying a bracha. Therefore, it's not baltoisif. Because you're eating in the sukkah, but you're not saying a bracha, you don't have a problem of baltoisif. You're not saying a leisha basukah. But sleeping in the sukkah, you never say a bracha leisha basukah. If you never say a bracha leisha basukah on sleeping, you only say a bracha leisha basukah on eating. So now when you sleep in the sukkah, there's no difference between you slept there on Yom Tov and now you're sleeping there on Shmini Atzeres. You slept there on Sukkot and you're sleeping there on Shmini Atzeres. It looks the same. So you're basically being baltoisif. It looks like a baltoisif. If you would normally make a bracha like Leisha Basukah, and now you're going to dwell there and you're not going to say a Leisha Basukah, no problem. You can sit in the sukkah. Because you're doing a heker, you're making it clear that it's not baltoisif. You're not saying a bracha. But if you would sleep in the sukkah, according to the Rav Yah, that would be a big problem, because sleeping in the sukkah would be the same on Shmini Atzeres as you do it on the other days of Sukkot, and it looks like baltoisif. So according to the Rav Yah, you're not allowed to sleep in the sukkah. Now, the Beis Yosef doesn't follow the Rav Yah's opinion. The Beis Yosef mentions that you should sleep in the sukkah, and seemingly because the fact that you're the reason for any issues is not about Tosef issue. In other words, Beis Yosef doesn't follow that line of thinking. The Beis Yosef only follows the concept of, is it a zilzal? So, of course, taking a lulav would be a zilzal, but but the sleeping in a sukkah is not a problem. However, comes along the Darkei Moshe. Darkei Moshe says it's not so simple. Even according to Tosfos, you can't say this whole logic of sleeping in the sukkah, because sleeping in the sukkah, who goes outside to sleep? You go outside to eat, no problem. Like Taisa says over here, it's areva, it's pleasant. But to go sleep outside, that's a problem. How could you go sleep outside? It's very clear that you're being mazalzel in the Yom Tov, because no one normally does that. And if you're going to go and sleep outside, you're being mazalzel in the Yom Tov. Therefore, don't sleep outside. For sure, according to the Rav Yayav Rambal Tosef. But even according to Tosef, you have a problem of zilzal. This is a problem that you're being mazalzel in the Yom Tov by doing a doing a minhag of Chol HaMoed of sleeping in the sukkah versus Shmini Atzeres. In other words, you're emphasizing that this is a suffix shvi'i, which is a problem. To bring that out, to emphasize that it's a minhag choil, which means you're acting like it's Chol HaMoed, not Yom Tov of Shmini Atzeres. So according to the Darkei Moshe, the Ramah, you're not supposed to sleep in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. I'm not so familiar with anyone who does sleep in the sukkah, but I believe they probably follow, at least Ashkenazim who sleep in the sukkah, they probably follow this Darkei Moshe, and they don't sleep in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. That would be my guess, but I'm not sure. I guess I'd have to look into that. So this is regarding sleeping in the sukkah. There is a discussion.
To the extent it's helpful, my father on Shmini Atzeres would only go into the sukkah after davening, gesegnet sich mit dem sukkah. You went inside, you made kiddush, but you didn't wash. You made kiddush in the sukkah and you said goodbye. And then you went to the house to eat.
Right. So we discussed that it does that is a minhag of Hasidim.
Yes.
And we mentioned that it doesn't seem to fit the Gemara.
Yes.
The Gemara says Yasav Yasvina, that you're supposed to dwell in the sukkah. And yes. Don't say Elisha Sukkah. So the minhag of all the common tradition of all Ashkenazic Jewry, non-Hasidim, and Litvisha, and Sephardic Jewry is always to dwell in the sukkah and Shmini Atzeres outside of Israel. But there seems to be this questionable minhag of Hasidim, which we tried to explain. So
without Elisha Basukkah.
Yeah, you don't say Elisha Basukkah, but still, the fact is the Gemara seems to paskin that you have to dwell in the sukkah. You have to dwell properly in the sukkah. So how is it that many people are not dwelling in the sukkah, especially Chassidim who are so mahadir in mitzvahs?
The night before, I don't remember what we do.
Well, the minhag of Chassidim is not to be makbid to eat in the sukkah, whatever, which on Shmini Atzeres. Well, however, they're going to make kiddush or this, but they're definitely not following the way,
Gemara.
Like the Gemara, and the way you do it during the other 7 days of Sukkot, where you would be makbid to eat. Your suda has to be in the sukkah. So we explained that possibly based on this Tosfos, which is also explained a little more in the Karban Nesanel on the Rosh, that the whole heter of dwelling in the sukkah and not shaking lulav is based on the fact that it's areva, that it looks like it's pleasant. So if it's at all cold or uncomfortable in the sukkah, then you're really not supposed to dwell in the sukkah. That's the way Tais, just like you're not supposed to shake the lulav. It's a noyig by minhag chayil. it's not appropriate for Yantiv. So if you're showing that you're dwelling in the sukkah, what you're bringing out is, guess what? It's still Chol HaMoed Sukkos. It's not Shmini Atzeres. It's a Savik Shvi'i. This is really Hoshana Rabbah. You're being Naya, you're Mazalzel in the Yantiv. So therefore, that would be like a heter. Again, we're giving a defense. This is not brought in Shulchan Aruch, this heter. They were just trying to find the defense that that the Yidden are holy, Yisrael Kadoshim Heim, and there is a source, and there is a Taisus Rabbeinu Peretz that seems to say that's why at night we don't dwell in the sukkah because it's too cold, but by day, it seems like maybe he would, or So there seems to be some hints in the Rishonim to this type of a concept. Here we have the Taisvis, there is a Taisvis Rabbeinu Peretz, but in Shulchan Aruch it's not brought. So according to the letter of the law, we really have to dwell in the sukkah. But to find some type of a defense for the for this minhag, we're sharing some thoughts that what it could be based on. The problem with these heterim is that if it's comfortable to dwell in the sukkah, then you really should be dwelling in the sukkah. And maybe in Poland, they didn't dwell in the sukkah because it was freezing. But here in Florida, maybe this heter doesn't apply. So that's really the issue. That according to these heterim, now there is one other heter, and that is that the Svasema says, Yesh Loimar, that the wording in the Gemara is not that you have to dwell in the sukkah, that Mesav Yasvinon, to dwell in the sukkah if you want, you could dwell in it, but definitely don't make a bracha. So in other words, he has a possible, again, a defense that maybe that's the source is Mesav Yasvina, not that you have to dwell in it, not that it's a mitzvah to dwell in it, but more that it's a heter to dwell in it, and and that would be the reason. That would be the reason for that. My father sent me a information over here that he once heard from a Rav that maybe they were basing it on the fact that in the Zohar it says there's a prohibition to sit in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, and that's why Hasidim don't do it. So that sounds like an interesting source. That the only problem is, he writes here that that would apply only in that the Zohar was written in Eretz Yisrael. So there, you're right, you shouldn't dwell in the sukkah. But how would that apply in Chutz La'aretz? Okay, so so that's interesting. We have to find that Zohar and see what it says really about dwelling in the sukkah, and and what the reason for that would be. But anyway, the bottom line is that the Shulchan Aruch seems clear that you have to dwell in the sukkah, but sleeping is another story. Sleeping seems to have, seems like there is issues with sleeping in the sukkah. It's either because of Baltoisif, there's no heker with the bracha because you anyway don't say a bracha, or because it's not normal to go outside to sleep. It's normal to go outside to eat, but not to go outside to sleep, and therefore there would be a reason not to sleep in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So now what I wanted to mention is two more things. One is regarding eating fruits outside a sukkah or in a sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So according to this logic of the Rav Yah, that anything that you don't make a heker, recognition that there's a difference, make some type of a sign that you're doing it different, that there could be baltaisif. You're adding on to a mitzvah. Really, sukkah is supposed to be 7 days. You're adding on an 8th day. Well, so eating fruits in a sukkah maybe should be considered like baltaisif. And if you would be eating a meal, no problem, because you're not saying leisha b'sukkah. But if you're eating fruits, so during sukkahs when you eat fruits, you don't say leisha b'sukkah. Now you're not saying leisha b'sukkah, so it looks the same as when it was sukkahs. So you're doing baltaisif. So that could be looked at as a problem, to the extent that I heard that the Chassam Sofer would that brought down that he would not sleep in the sukkah and he would not eat fruits in the sukkah on Shemini Atzeres. That's this is possibly based on this, that he was machmer like this Rav Yah, that he was nervous that it's al Taisif. Because according to Taisvis, there's no reason not to. It's not a zilzal. It's not. It doesn't look like cholamayit if you're eating fruits in the sukkah. It looks like you're enjoying outside. You go outside and eat a meal, eat fruits. It's perfect. There's no. It doesn't. You're not being mazalzel in the Yom Tov. You're not disgracing the Yom Tov. The shaming the Yom Tov. But the thing is that you could be machalik. You could differentiate and say that there's a difference between eating fruits and sleeping. Sleeping, you're really supposed to sleep in a sukkah. And so for sleeping, if you sleep in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, it looks like you're being moisif on a mitzvah, Bal Taisif. You're adding on to the mitzvah. The mitzvah was 7 days. You're now dwelling in the sukkah on the 8th day, and you're not doing anything differently because before you used to sleep in the sukkah, and now you're sleeping in the sukkah. So that would be a problem to sleep in the sukkah. But eating fruits, there's no obligation in the first place to eat fruits in the sukkah. And so maybe only something that you're mechuyev in a sukkah would there be an issue of Bal Tosef. And therefore, something that's totally not obligated, then you don't have a problem of Bal Tosef, even though you're not making a hecker, because it's the same before and after. You don't. It's not like one time you that on sukkahs you say leishev and now you don't. The fruits you never say leishev. Nevertheless, it's not a problem to eat the fruits in the sukkah because this is not an item that you're obligated to dwell in the sukkah for, and that would require a sukkah, and therefore you wouldn't say in such a thing Bal Tosef. So anyway, bottom line is that fruits are permissible to eat in the sukkah, and it seems like the minhag in Lubavitch is to be machmer, to dwell, to everything in the sukkah. Of course, we don't sleep in the sukkah, but eating and fruits and water, even on Shmini Atzeres, it seems that that's the minhag in Lubavitch to dwell in the sukkah with all and completely based on the Gemara. Yasev Yasvina, well in the sukkah. Just don't say a bracha. The other question with this whole discussion is on the Seder night, the second Seder. What is the halacha about Sfiras Ha'omer? If you count Sfira and you called it the second night of you're counting Sfira, you're calling it the first night of Sfiras Ha'omer. You counted. The question is, how can you then make Kiddush and say that it's Yom Tov? In other words, wouldn't that also be like a zilzul by reciting the bracha on Sfiras Ha'omer? You're claiming that it's Chol HaMoed because you don't count Sfira on Yom Tov. Sfira is counted the day after Yom Tov, Machras HaPesach, Machras Shabbos, and which is the day after. That's when you count Sfiras Ha'omer. And if that's so, if you count Sfira and you're celebrating this day as a Yom Tov, seemingly this is like a zilzul in the Yom Tov, count Sfira. So not only that, it's also like a tarti desasu.
Only in Eretz Yisrael.
In Eretz Yisrael, you don't do a Seder. You're not counting it Yom Tov. No problem. In Eretz Yisrael, you have no problem because it is Chol HaMoed and you're counting Sfira. There you have no problem. But here in Chutz La'aretz, what are you doing? You're doing like a contradiction here. On the one hand, you're saying a bracha of Sfiras Ha'omer, And on the other hand, you're sitting down, you're making kiddush. How could you reconcile that? I'm making kiddush, but I'm counting Sfiras Iyar, which says that it's really the day after Yom Tov. It's really Chol HaMoed. You don't count Sfira on Yom Tov. Sfira is a mitzvah to do on Chol HaMoed, to start on Chol HaMoed. So it's a contradiction, and it's a zilzal. And so how could you do that? So the Ran asks this question. The Ran says two things. He says, number one, the problem would be if in the same cup of kiddush you say leishev basukah and you're calling it Shmini Atzeres HaChag, that would be a contradiction. That would be Tarti Desasri. That would be a zilzal in Yom Tov. You're calling it Yom Tov, you're calling it Shmini Atzeres, and you're saying Leishev Basukah. It's a contradiction. It's a zilzal. But he says, here, I counted Sfira, and now I'm making Kiddush. It's two separate, it's not on the same kais. It's not in the same cup of wine that I'm doing. But there, it's not a problem. He says, a second thing, he says that counting Sfira, this is a mitzvah daraisa. Because it's a mitzvah daraisa, not everyone agrees with that, but there are shitas that holds counting Sfiras Iyar as daraisa, it's biblical. And he says, therefore, it wouldn't be a problem to you would still need to count Sfira because you have to fulfill this biblical mitzvah. Something along those lines is how he reconciles the ability to count Sfira, even though you're celebrating it as a Yom Tov and you're making Kiddush and so on. Okay, so anyway, there's a few things that commentaries talk about here. There is one other thing that is brought down, and that is that the Gemara had brought a statement of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef says that follow Rabbi Yochanan because all the great people of the generation, Rav Huna Bar Bizna, and all the great people of the generation, they dwelled in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, but they didn't say the bracha. And the Gemara asked the question, well, maybe they didn't say a bracha, not because you don't say a bracha leisha basukah on Shmini Atzeres. Maybe they didn't say a bracha because they hold like a previous Gemara we learned, where some say you just say a bracha once for the whole yontif. So maybe, and the Gemara answered that they were in the meadow, fields for yontif, and they never said the bracha leisha basukah. So it's not like they said it already. And that maybe that's why they didn't say it on Shmini Atzeres, because once you say it once, according to some, you don't have to say it ever again that year. But these people, these were great people, they didn't end up saying it at all that year. And now they arrive in a city, and there's a Shmini Shmini Atzeres, and they ate in the sukkah, but they didn't say leisha basukah. You see, you don't say bracha leisha basukah and Shmini Atzeres. That was the Gemara's statement. The famous question on this Gemara is that there is an obligation to dwell in the sukkah on the first night that overrides the regular rules of sukkah. Normally, there's a lot of leniencies on sukkahs not to eat in a sukkah. Rains, it's a teshu kein taduru. You have to dwell in the way that you would dwell in your house, and so there's leniencies on sukkahs if it's very seriously uncomfortable and there's problems you could get away. There's heterim, but the first night of sukkahs, you're obligated to dwell in a sukkah because of a Gzeira Shava Tesvav from that we learned from Pesach, that just like Pesach, it's a mitzvah of a Suda, so we learned that on Sukkot also, that there's a major obligation to be fulfilling the mitzvahs of Sukkot on the first night. The first night has a major obligation. And even though it rains, you would still be obligated in dwelling in the sukkah because of this Gzeira Shava Tesvav, that it obligates us to have a Suda and to fulfill the mitzvahs and to be in a sukkah on Sukkot. So seemingly, it's surprising that these rabbis didn't fulfill that obligation Okay, they didn't have a sukkah there. I understand that they could get away without eating in a sukkah because they're called holchei drachim. They're travelers. There's leniencies, for people who are traveling. They have a leniency not to dwell in a sukkah, but that doesn't permit them not to fulfill the mitzvah of the Gzeira Shava Tesvav that we learned from Pesach. That just like Pesach, the first night of Pesach, you're obligated to have a kazayas matzah. So also on Sukkot, you would be obligated to eat in the Sukkah kazayas. So on this is a somewhat of a question. How what was their situation? So on this, the seemingly there seems to be an understanding. There's an opinion. Marshall has an opinion that says that the obligation of tesvav is an obligation of eating a kazayas on the first night of Sukkot, but that doesn't obligate you to dwell in the Sukkah. So the same leniency of not dwelling in the Sukkah of holchei drachim, of travelers, there is such a leniency as well. You could use that even on the first night. You'd still be obligated eating kazayas, but it could be that obligation you could fulfill by just eating it, even not in a sukkah, meaning you could fulfill that obligation even if you were not in a sukkah, and maybe that could be an understanding over here. Okay, we are holding Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We're on page 47a. And we're right in the middle of the page, maybe about 18 lines from the top, maybe. I would say maybe 20 lines from the top. And 47a. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ayimrim Zman B'Shmini Shalchad. You say Shachiyanu on the 8th day on Shmini Atzeres. Bein Ayimrim Zman B'Shvi Shal Pesach. But you don't say Shachiyanu on Shvi Shal Pesach. And one of these rabbis, either Reb Levi or Chama, they said, Teda, I'll bring you a proof that you have to say Shachiyanu on Shmini Atzeres. Shaharei, because Choluk b'shloisha dvarim. Shmini Atzeres is different than the other days of Sukkot in 3 ways. Number 1, b'sukkah, you don't dwell in the Sukkah. And in the other days of Sukkot, you dwell in the Sukkah. Lulav, you shake the lulav on all the other days of Sukkot, but you don't do that on Shmini Atzeres. V'nisoch hamayim, and there's the ceremony of the nisoch hamayim was done on the other days of Sukkot, but not on Shmini Atzeres. But there is an opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that says that they would actually do nisoch hamayim 8 days, not 7 days, and they would do it on Shmini Atzeres as well. So even according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is still a difference between Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, and therefore there's reason to say that you would say a bracha shachiyanu on Shmini Atzeres because of these 2 differences. You don't have nisoch hamayim difference because they do pour the water pouring in the Beis Hamikdash, even on Shmini Atzeres according to Rabbi Yehuda. But nevertheless, you still have the other differences. Now, it comes out that Shmini Atzeres would be a regel b'fnei atzma, it's a holiday of its own, and therefore you would need to say a shachiyanu. The Gemara asks, if so, Shvi shal Pesach nami. What about the 7th day of Pesach? Also, harei cholok b'achilas matzah. It is different than the beginning of Pesach, the first day, where there is an obligation of eating matzah. The Amar Mar, because Master said, Laila Rishayna Chayva Mikan Belach Rishos. The first night is an obligation. Afterwards is it's optional. It's Rishos, permissible, and you don't have to eat matzah. So because of this difference, that would be a reason to say, if this is a holiday, it's different, being that this is a holiday, Shvi Shal Pesach, and it's different. There's a difference than the earlier days. It must be called a regel b'fnei atzma. It must be called a holiday in its own right. And the Gemara says, Hachi hashta. No, there's a big difference. Hasam milayla cholok, miyoim einay cholok. There on Shvi Shal Pesach, it is different than the night of the first night, but it's not different than the first day, because even on the first day of Pesach, there is no obligation in eating matzah. And so the last day of Pesach, excuse me, the seventh day of Pesach is similar to the first day. And therefore, there's no Shechianu. It's no different. Basically, the same halachas. Is not really difference in halachas, and therefore it's one holiday. It's not called a regel b'fnei atzmai, a holiday of its own right. Hacha here on Shmini Atzeres, afilu miyoim nami cholok. Shmini Atzeres is different. That it's even different than the first day of Yom Tov and all of these things, and therefore, you would say a shechiyah. Ravina Amar. Ravina says cholok mishalafanav. Excuse me. Zeh cholok mishalafanav. V'zeh cholok mishalafnei fanav. This one is different from the thing that was right before it. And what does that mean? That Shmini Atzeres is different than the seventh day, than Hoshana Rabbah. Because Hoshana Rabbah, you would shake lulav, pour the Nisach HaMayim, you dwell in the Sukkah, and Shmini Atzeres, you don't. So therefore, it's very different than from the day right before it. This, you might say, is different than the first day, but it's not different than the seventh day. It's different than the sixth day. It's different than the first. It's different than what's much earlier than it on the first night. But it's no different than the day before, because even Chol Hamoed, eating matzah is optional. Oh, time is up. Okay, we're going to stop here. I just want to mention that tomorrow, Hashem,